Hi, I'm Bill Scott. I was a former flight test engineer in the Air Force and then out of the Air Force. Later went to work for Aviation Week magazine. Did a lot of flying there, writing stories about whatever happened on those flights. And then I was a civil pilot too. So throughout that time, I logged an awful lot of time in many different kinds of airplanes. And that brings us to where we are today. What I call RPM. RPM, good stuff when you're flying. That means the engine's turning and burning, everything's looking good. But for this, we're going to call this, it stands for routine, professionalism, and magic. I'll have about 3 stories in each category that pretty much capsulize my 40+ years of flying. And stories are kind of the soul of aerospace as I see it. They're the golden threads in the tapestry of aerospace. And since man first took to the skies, people have been telling stories about flying. And the term hangar flying came about when airmen were grounded, sat around the hangar, and they were telling stories. And some of the best stories started like this: "There I was," or "You ain't gonna believe this." Well, sometime as we get older, those stories kind of age and get a little bit better. It's an adage among flyers that the older we get, the better we were. And sometimes those stories have a way of progressing along to the point where the old adage comes forward, and that is, among flyers, flying is hours and hours of boredom interspersed with moments of sheer terror. But as we get older and become gray eagles, bald eagles, we kind of get reminded in certain ways that we are has-been flyers perhaps. And I kind of ran into that a number of years ago when I went through the altitude chamber out at Peterson Air Force Base, and I handed my kind of well-weathered, yellowed physiological training form to this two-stripe airman, and she says, "Gee, sir, first time you went through the chamber, I wasn't even born." Ouch. So routine. In the flying business, there's really no such thing as routine flights. You fly long enough, and you will see that adage of moments of sheer terror interspersed among the boredom. So anything can happen at any time, ranging from minor emergencies to some of those "oh my God, I'm going to die" moments. And I'll run through a few examples here. This one wasn't any real big deal, but I was in the back seat of an F4C at Hill Air Force Base, Utah, just coming back from a weapons test mission. And on final approach, we had a primary hydraulic failure. The gear came down okay, but if a second failure happened, we'd be in trouble. So the test pilot declared an emergency, and that immediately launched all kind of activity on the ground. Fire trucks scrambled, and alerts sounded across the base. And then the tower transmitted the most unsettling statement that a flight crew can hear: "How many souls on board?" I felt like grabbing the mic button and yelling, "There are 2 souls on board, and they're still wearing their little pink bodies. We really like to keep it that way." Well, we landed, rolled out, didn't have to take the far end barrier with a tail hook like we thought we might. Everything turned out okay, but we taxied back, shut down as we were climbing out of the airplane. Kept running through my mind, how in the world did the aviation business come up with that macabre term, "how many souls on board?" And to date, I really don't know. I never found a good reason for it. Another exciting moment was the Canadair Challenger program. I was a flight test engineer on this. Notice that it has a T-tail, and that gave it, this particular airplane, a deep stall characteristic. And that means when the airplane stalls, you can't get the nose down, in simple terms. Well, the Canadian certification authorities had dictated that we had to have an aerodynamic stall that could not have any electronic devices. on board. But the Americans had figured out through years of experience that you really need a stick shaker and a stick pusher, an electronic stall protection system, to keep a T-tailed airplane out of that deep stall region. Well, we didn't have that. We were trying to figure out using stall strips and other methods to get a controlled roll-off as the stall identification. But on April 2nd, 1980, the test crew heard this incredibly loud banging noise in the airplane and aborted the mission, thinking something was broken. The ground crew went through everything. The mechanics could not find any reason for that, nothing broken. So on the morning of April 3rd, we, the crew, were told to try to isolate that noise if possible. There was 2 test pilots, and I, as the flight test engineer, took off, started working our way through the test card, and only at one particular configuration of flaps and gear did we hear the banging noise. We decided to finish the test card without a problem. Then we elected to go back to that configuration and redo that particular approach to stall, with one difference. Instead of going all the way to stall, as soon as the banging noise started, the captain, Norm, in the left seat, would hold that angle of attack while I looked around the cabin trying to find something that might be loose with all the test equipment we had back there. So that's what we did. We were at a constant angle of attack when the stall vane stuck. We had 2 vanes on that long pitot tube out in front of the airplane, and the stall angle of attack vane froze. And that was because it had come from the manufacturer, missing an O-ring, fine sand had gotten in there, and that was enough to make the vane stick right at the time we were trying to hold a constant angle of attack. Well, when that vane broke loose due to the vibration, it pegged, and we knew we were deep stalled. So both pilots pushed forward on their control columns to try to break it. The nose was not coming down. So we're falling at this point, nose up, about 30-degree angle or 50-degree angle of attack, about 30 degrees of deck angle. So the co-pilot deployed the anti-spin chute we had on the back of the airplane there in that blue canister. And that broke the stall, pitched the nose down. We thought we were flying home. And then the chute release mechanisms failed. 2 of them. The hydraulic release system failed twice and went to explosive bolts that should have just separated that chute and its mounting from the airframe, and they didn't fire. So we couldn't get rid of the chute. I hollered 6,000 feet, which meant we were about 4,000 feet above the ground, and Norm gave the bailout order. I threw my pencil, unsnapped the lap belt, and I was just unhooking the mic cord when I thought I heard Norm say, "Got it made." In fact, he was saying, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Challenger 1 is bailing out." But once you're given the order, you don't look back. I headed for the back of the airplane and knelt on the floor, fired a handle that pulled in a baggage door we had configured as an escape hatch. It pulled in, and when I was in the doorway then to jump, I couldn't believe how close the ground was. Sagebrush was racing by pretty smartly there. So I jumped, said my little 1001, and got a real heavy shock from the chute opening, and it was the first jump I'd ever made. So I checked the chute was in good shape, no lines over, no holes, and then I pulled on one riser, turned around where I could see the airplane as it was approaching the ground. Dave was already on the ground. The co-pilot was already down. I saw something dark come out of the left side of the airplane and knew that Norm had gotten out just before the airplane hit the ground, blew up, turned into this massive orange fireball. So Norm Ronison, unfortunately, was killed. He did not get a good shoot. Dave broke his leg in 3 places. And that little thing down the corner is the caterpillar pin. That's what people get when they have to use a parachute in anger. You don't keep your takeoffs and landings in a 1-to-1 ratio. So what happened? there was that dust that got into the angle attack vane. Because there's no O-ring, it stuck, and that's what got us into the deep stall at the worst possible time. And the chute release, the hydraulic release failed because a seal in the system had deteriorated due to an incompatibility with the kind of hydraulic fluid we were using at that time in that system. And we never did really figure out why the explosive bolts didn't work. It may have been a switch issue, surprisingly. They worked fine in there. But you can see in this particular slide that the spin chute, or anti-spin chute, was still attached after the airplane crashed. It's that white thing in the upper left corner. Another situation that got a little hairy was the DC-8 hush kit test, we called it. About 1 foot extensions were added to the leading edge of each of the engines, and the aft end of the engine was treated with special sound absorbing material to quiet the airplane down so it could keep flying as the noise requirements were changed by the FAA. We had an FAA pilot flying in the left seat to get that new configuration certified, and we had to do steady heading side slips in order to confirm that we had not changed the lateral directional characteristics of the airplane by adding those extensions on the leading edge of each engine. So the pilot was almost a full rudder, not quite, decided to give it just a little more rudder to, so we could say he had full rudder, and that put a little bit of rate in the side slip. That stalled the vertical tail, and we immediately snapped to about 135 degrees bank angle. Well, that got everybody's attention. He went full aileron and rudder the other direction, and then we were just doing 90, 90, 90 as the nose dropped. We kept snapping to 90-degree banks in both directions. Our pilot in the right seat took over and finally got us pulled out of that thing. And we went back, confirmed we had no damage to the airplane by a tower flyby, landed, and it was a very quiet debrief. The next day I got a call from another Dave, who we had shanghaied to be the flight engineer, run the panel in the DC-8, and he says, "How are you doing?" "Fine." What's the matter? Did you get hurt and all this? No, but I've been kind of a zombie for the last 24 hours because right in the middle of all that flopping around, my mind made the switch. I knew we were dead. And frankly, I think I'm just getting used to living again. Professionalism. From the executive office to the hangar floor and the flight line and the cockpit, I've worked with some really great aerospace professionals. And they set a really high standard of professionalism and innovation too. So one example that I was privileged to witness was on a B-1B global power mission. In 1994, Saddam Hussein's troops raced down to the Kuwait-Iraqi border, and then they backed off. Well, the White House decided they weren't going to let him yank our chain like that, so they ordered 2 global power missions, and these were regularly scheduled. They were done on a normal basis, but in this particular one, we sent 2 B-1s out of Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, and 2 B-52s out of Minot in North Dakota. So we launched with 4 B-1s, and as soon as we confirmed at the first refueling that we could, quote, take gas, 2 of them turned around and went back home. So there was 2 B-1s pressed on, and then behind us a few hours were the B-52s. So we flew 24.9 hours nonstop from South Dakota to Kuwait and then back out. We had 4 in-flight refuelings, and some of those were in the middle of the night. I'll tell more about that later. I was on this airplane. It was called Deadwood Dealer, and we had 28 Mark 82 500-pound live bombs. Why was I on that in the first place? Well, I was working for Aviation Week at the time, and General Mike Lowe, who was the aircraft commander, had said, quote, "I want an Av Week guy on one of those B-1s to tell the story of what this global power mission was all about." So one of those in-flight refuelings was over the Atlantic at night in the clouds. I was kind of sporting, finding the tankers, one for each airplane, each B-1. We finally found them, got hooked up, and we were taking on fuel with no problem. But the other B-1 had a seal problem between the airplane and the boom on the tanker. So fuel was spraying across his windscreen the whole time he was hanging on that tanker boom. He was able to get gas. It just took a lot longer, and the poor pilot was pretty much worn out by the time we finally got off. So we pressed on through the Mediterranean, turned into over Egypt airspace. At that time, we were roughly 15 minutes behind the established timeline. But these sharp, innovative guys talked to each other over the Have Quick Secure link. Then they decided to contact a liaison on the ground. They got permission for us to take a shortcut across Saudi Arabia, and we were back online on the timeline. We dropped to about 500 feet, smoking in towards the target, which was just a collection of old burnout Iraqi vehicles that were assembled within view of the Kuwait-Iraqi border. And there was a bunch of sheiks out there for this, quote, air power demonstration. So as we're running in, the weapons system operator was tweaking the radar, the side-looking radar, to get the cursors right on the target. And the captain, Tony, kept saying, "Grinch," that was the call sign of the weapons system operator, the Wizzo. And he says, "You got it?" "Not yet, stand by." "Come on, Grinch, you got it?" "Just a minute, stand by." And finally, Tony says, "Grinch, give me a warm fuzzy." Grinch says, "I've got it." Turn to this heading, etc. So we pressed on, ran right across the target, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bam, the bombs rippled out, 28 of them, and it just looked like sparklers going off behind us. It was a shack. We were right smack on the target. We put the bombs right across the target, and we were 1 second off the time over target that had been established days before we actually left. Back out through Egypt, and we got to the Mediterranean, did another in-flight refueling, but the adrenaline was pretty much gone at that time. So we were taking turns sleeping according to a schedule. There was only room for one guy to sleep in the aisle of the B-1. So Tony, the aircraft commander, said, "Hey, Bill, you want to come up here and fly a little bit while I take a nap?" "Sure." So I crawled into the right seat, and you got to understand, I was not a military pilot. I was a civil pilot. So flying formation for me is keep the other guy in sight. It took me a while to sort of settle in there to where I could keep a respectable distance from the other airplane. By the time I kind of got it wired, I noticed that it was very quiet. Tony's asleep down there on the floor. I knew Grinch was asleep. He was before he even went up front. Looked over, and the co-pilot, who was in the left seat, he was sitting there head down, Tootsie Roll Pop stick sticking out of his mouth, sound asleep. So I said, I wonder what General Lowe would say if he knew the Aviation Week guy had total control of his B-1 bomber halfway around the world. After we landed in the Azores, they refueled both the airplanes, put new crews on them, a little bit of oil in one engine, and flew those airplanes right back to Ellsworth. I thought it was an incredible testament to those who designed and built that airplane and to the professionalism of the crews that fly them. Throughout that entire mission, not once did I hear those well-trained crews suggest that we abort. They figured things out on the fly, innovating where they had to, and there was never any discussion about aborting mission for any reason. Early on in my Air Force career, I was involved in a very secret program that involved nuclear sampling. Now, what does that mean? We flew a variety of airplanes to gather up radioactive debris and radioactive gases from weapons tests. We flew against the Russian, Chinese, French, and our own tests. And because it was a highly classified intelligence gathering mission, our cover story was that we were weather monitors. In fact, it was a true technical intel mission. We didn't wear any patches on the flight suits, black ball caps, and we only carried military ID cards and Geneva Convention cards. And all the debris that we brought back on filter papers and gaseous samples went to special labs scattered around the world. And those labs could tell you everything there was to know about that weapon, including what color it was painted. I was called an airborne special equipment operator, and even though I was only wearing 2 stripes, we were a small hand-picked group of people doing a very important mission, and the results of which would often land on the president's desk a few days after the mission. We kind of operated like a special forces team. Rank didn't matter, the expertise did. You might have a lieutenant colonel up front flying the airplane as a commander, but a 2-stripe SEO would be directing the search and the sampling process. My hottest mission was a domestic shot down at the Nevada test site. We flew down there overnight in an old C-54, stayed at the old Stardust Hotel in Las Vegas. So the next morning, about 4 a.m., we were walking through the casino, the only way to get in and out of those places, and we were in a line marching behind this elderly couple that was playing the slots there. And the lady glanced up as we walked behind and she said, "Hey, Harry, who are those guys?" Well, Harry glanced at us and says, "Hell, I don't know. Maybe they're plumbers." Well, those plumbers, a few hours later, were orbiting just outside the test area as the announcer, the test director over the radio was counting down and torched off this kiloton class nuclear weapon that was buried 1,500 feet under the ground. And it was a sight to see. The surface heaved and shock waves traveled out like you dropped a pebble into a pool of water or a pond. And that caused a little shift in a fault line nobody knew was there. That put up a little puff of dirt that went racing over the hills at sonic speed. Kind of looked like a cartoon Roadrunner. And we waited for a while, and sure enough, as they worried about and why we were there, the hole fell in. The blast had created a cavern down underground, and then that thing fell in. When it did, put up a big cloud of dirt, radioactive material in it, of course, and we drove in and started sampling. We just drifted with the cloud, orbiting in it, until we used up all of our filter papers and all of the gaseous bottles were filled up. So we headed back towards Sacramento, where we were based, and en route we cleaned up everything at the equipment table where we were. And I later suffered a little bit of radiation sickness. Lost about 10 pounds, a little bit of hair, had some nausea not long after the flight. And but it was my own fault. Like a fool, I ate my flight lunch right there at the same bench where we'd been handling those papers with the nuclear debris on it. And by the way, the mission was declassified in the 70s, so I'm not telling you anything that is classified. But the mission has kind of maintained a low profile, and it wasn't until 1997 that the unit, Air Force Technical Application Center, allowed me as an Aviation Week guy to tell that amazing story of that mission. Perhaps the height of my career in witnessing professionalism were the flight demonstration teams, and there's some great ones all around the world. I would say in this country, the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds are kind of at the top of the heap. So in 2005, we did an Aviation Week package, cover package we call the Birds and the Blues. My boss, the editor-in-chief, Tony Veloci, flew with the Thunderbirds. I flew with the Blue Angels. I joined the Blue Angels in El Centro, California, where they were going through their winter training program. And that's about a 10-week period where they break in the new guys on the team, work with some guys that have been there at least one season before. They normally fly on the order of 120 flights during that period. And later, once they've got it all together, they fly at that time on the order of 69 shows in at least 34 cities during a full season. And the training program is pretty intense. The pilots typically fly maybe 2 to 3 times a day. Then they hit the gym, clean up, then they go eat together as a team, go back to their rooms and study, grab some sleep, get up, do it again the next day. It's all about dedication and repetition. They just practice and practice and practice. In 2006, I was invited back to fly in the diamond formation this time. First time was just a single ship, the typical go out and show the reporter what we do flight. But this time I flew in the diamond in the slot position. That's the number 4 guy that has his nose right under the lead airplane, the boss, and then there's 2 wingmen there too. We flew a complete show, all the way from the walk down to the formation takeoff, immediately go into a half Cuban 8, and then it's 40 plus minutes of 5 to 7.5 G maneuvers. It's very demanding. And these guys fly tight. The 12 to 24 inch separation is kind of the norm. And at one point, as we were making the diamond pass in front of the crowd, if I could have stood up in the back seat of that number 4 airplane, I could have grabbed the wingtip of the right wingman, the missile rail there. So then we did a full program. Did the diamond pass, the diamond 360 they call it, pass, and then a full round or a program of maneuvers. I'll talk about some of those later, but it's all about trust and confidence. And that I found to be a pretty amazing culture. And the boss there that year, Steve Foley, explained it this way. He said, it's less of a stated contract with one another that I'll be here and you'll be there. But we take time to painstakingly train everyone, going through a building block approach to develop a degree of proficiency. And trust and confidence manifest as a result of that through the development of skill sets and proficiency. And that applies, of course, to the solos too, the 2 airplanes that fly head-on at times, 800 to 1,000 knot closing rates. And often on the opposing pass like this, they can be 25, 75 feet apart, canopy to canopy. And that year, Lieutenant Commander Ted Bunza Steelman said this way, it's just mechanics, but when it comes time to do a head-on pass, I don't even think about whether he'll pull just a hair too much positive G that might create closure between us. And JB, trust me, to always be predictable, whether it's the calm cadence, a clearing maneuver, or whatever. And some of those maneuvers include what they call the diamond dirty loop with the gear down, the diamond aileron roll all together, the fleur-de-lis, the diamond 360, and a half dozen others. What's interesting is many of their maneuvers are full deflection inputs. Why? Because everything's got to be predictable. So all the roll rates, all the maneuvers have to be very predictable. As Steve Foley said, we don't like surprises. We like predictability. And they routinely pull up to 7.5 Gs, but they do not wear G suits. Why? Because they run the seat down and the pilots fly with their right arm on their right thigh because the F-18 has a center stick. They cannot tolerate that G suit inflating and deflating because that would move their arm just enough to perhaps move the airplane, and they can't tolerate that when they're flying so tight. So it's a lot of very complex maneuvers. But the craziest one that I was involved with was called the Diamond Double Farvel. It was most demanding for the slot position, and both the 4 airplane and the number 1 airplane flip inverted, and the wingmen just slide out and then slide back in. It's a pretty wild maneuver. But the Blue Angels live by a credo that's pretty amazing, and this credo withstands the changes in personnel that cycle through this team. So Boss Foley, the flight leader and squadron commander of the Blues the year I flew with him, said that this contract of trust was a deep commitment to, as he put it, dispassionate analysis, a willingness to self-critique, and taking ownership of an error that you might have made in a particular maneuver or series. And that willingness develops this critical bond. So I asked, is that proven Blue Angels tenet transferable to the private sector? And Foley kind of smiled and said, you know, if we could sprinkle a little Blue Angel dust everywhere, this would be a much better country. Moving on to the magic category. It takes a lot of teamwork by thousands of aerospace professionals to put one high-performance airplane in the air, but only the crew gets to experience the magic that's up there. That's an incredibly awe-inspiring three-dimensional universe that's both invigorating and deadly. Again, common refrain among flight crews is, I can't believe they pay me to do this, and if the money givers ever figure out that we live to fly, they make us pay them to do this. That can span the spectrum. I experienced it one night in a Cessna 172 flying across the Great Salt Lake. The sun was setting behind us, and the water and air was just settled down as smooth as glass. So the sun set behind us in the west, and the moon was rising, full moon, coming up over the Wasatch Mountains. You just knew that the world was all right, and that's flight magic. Another time was when I was in test pilot school. We went out on a student test mission in a T-38, and I was flying with Rusty Gideon. And after takeoff from Edwards, Rusty had to thread his way through these huge cumulus clouds that were around. Very early in the morning, they were tinted kind of gold. So as we're flying through these amazing cloud canyons, you really knew that this was magical flight. And Rusty said the only thing missing was that baritone voice guy on TV reciting High Flight. The other time was in an old EC-121T. It was a big 4-engine radar early warning aircraft, prop driven, and it's slow, noisy. We had been in the air almost 14 hours flying from Florida back to Sacramento. Everybody was tired, everybody was quiet on intercom when we just topped the Sierra Nevada mountains flying west when the aircraft commander over the intercom ordered the entire crew onto the flight deck. We all scrambled up there wondering what was going on, and it was pretty amazing what we saw. The whole Sacramento Valley was covered in fog, and as that setting sun was glancing off and coming off that fog deck, it turned it completely gold. It's the most amazing color of gold you can imagine. We were all just mesmerized there. As we descended towards those clouds and the sun was setting, it kind of went from a pure gold to sort of a reddish gold. And just before we went into the clouds, the sun dropped, and next thing you know, we're in the gray. We all went back to our seats, strapped in for landing, and I was determined to burn that image into my mind because I knew that I just witnessed one of those magical moments that's reserved for those who fly. Well, aviators have the great fortune to fly and then tell a bunch of stories later. But I have to say, we're also acutely aware of the hundreds, if not thousands, of dedicated professionals that it takes to put us in the air and ensure we get back on the ground safely. That extends from the mechanics and crew chiefs that work on the airplane to the executives, the engineers, and the skilled technicians that conceive, build, and maintain the airplane. And that whole spectrum of aerospace constitutes a very unique family. And I call that the family of flight. And I feel extremely grateful to have been one of those people blessed to be a member of that family. It's been a great ride. Since I retired from Av Week in 2007, finally had time to pursue another passion, that was writing novels. I've written 6 books now. 3 of them were novels. The first one, The Permit, it's fiction based on an actual event, and it's pretty much goes through and develops a story of Checkmate. That's a team of black ops assassins that's charged with neutralizing terrorists. But they use advanced high-tech weapons, and they send a loud and clear message to the outlaws, killer cops that they run into: you kill, you lie, you die. Space Wars, the first 6 hours of World War III, bad guys shoot down satellites, bad things happen on Earth. And then the sequel was Counterspace, the next hours of World War III. And what happens? Things get worse. The US and China come right up to the brink of nuclear war. And not shown on that slide is a new book. It's Combat Contrails, Vietnam, 18 true stories as told by the warriors who actually lived them. Thank you for your attention, and fly safe.